The gate crashed open before dawn, and Alice Bennet froze with the feed bucket still in her hand. Something had broken through the old wooden fence that separated her family's farm from the vast grounds of Ashcombe Manor. Hooves thundered across the yard, scattering hens in every direction, feathers flying like snow. She dropped the bucket and ran toward the frightened horses, her heart pounding, shouting for her brother to help before the animals hurt themselves or trampled the coop. In the chaos, she barely noticed the tall figure striding through the broken gate, his coat dark against the gray morning light, his face unreadable and calm despite the panic around him. He caught the lead horse's rope in one smooth motion, as if he had done this 1,000 times, and the animal quieted almost instantly under his steady hand. Alice stared at him, breathless, realizing with a jolt who he was. Edward Whitmore, the Duke of Ashcombe, a man the whole village whispered about but rarely saw. He was known for his silence, his cold distance since his wife's death years before. Yet here he stood in her yard, holding her family's fence rail in his other hand, looking almost embarrassed by the damage his horses had caused. He did not apologize with many words. He simply said the fence would be repaired that same day, and then he looked at her, really looked, in a way that made her forget the chickens still scattered across the grass. His eyes were tired but sharp, studying her as if she were the first surprising thing he had seen in a long time. Alice felt her cheeks warm and looked away first, busying herself with gathering the hens before he could see how flustered she had become. By midday, a group of workmen arrived exactly as he had promised, carrying fresh timber and tools. Alice watched from the kitchen window as they rebuilt the broken section of fence, stronger than before. She wondered if the Duke would come himself to check on the work, and felt foolish for wondering at all. A man like him had no reason to think twice about a farmer's daughter. Yet that evening, as she carried the last basket of eggs inside, she noticed a shape standing near the tree line at the edge of the manor grounds, still and quiet, watching the yard the way he had that morning. Her brother teased her about it over supper, saying the great Duke of Ashcombe had probably never spoken so many words to anyone outside his own household in years. Their mother hushed him quickly, warning that gossip about a man of his station could bring trouble to their door. But Alice could not stop thinking about the moment his hand had steadied the horse, the flicker of something unguarded in his expression, before he remembered himself and became distant again. She told herself it meant nothing. Dukes did not concern themselves with farm girls who fed chickens at sunrise. Still, when she latched the coop that night and glanced toward the manor one last time, she was almost certain she saw him still standing there, watching the yard long after the horses had been led safely home. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Alice found a small wooden carving resting on the repaired fence post, shaped carefully into the figure of a hen. There was no note, no signature, nothing to explain who had left it there. But she knew. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked it up, turning it over in the pale light, feeling the smooth grain of the wood beneath her fingers. Whoever had carved it had taken real care, real time over something so small. She glanced toward the manor windows, searching for a shadow, a movement, any sign of him, but the glass only reflected the rising sun. She placed the carving on the windowsill of her own room that night, unsure why it mattered so much to her. Word spread quickly through the village that the Duke had personally overseen the fence repairs, an unusual act for a man who typically sent his steward for such matters. Whispers followed her wherever she went, some curious, some sharp with judgment. Her father grew quiet whenever the subject came up, clearly uneasy about the attention his daughter had drawn from a man so far above their station. Alice tried to ignore the talk, focusing instead on her morning chores, though her eyes drifted toward the tree line more often than she wanted to admit. Days later, a basket of grain arrived at their door, delivered by the Duke's steward with a simple message of gratitude for the trouble his horses had caused. Alice suspected there was more behind the gesture than simple courtesy, especially when the steward lingered a moment longer than necessary, studying her with quiet curiosity of his own. That evening, walking the fence line to check the new posts, she found Edward standing there, waiting, his hands clasped behind his back like a man unsure of his own purpose in coming. Neither spoke at first. The silence between them felt heavier than any words could have been, filled with things neither seemed ready to say. Finally, he asked if the carving had reached her safely, his voice low, almost hesitant, so unlike the composed and distant figure the village described. Alice admitted she had kept it, and something shifted in his expression, a flicker of relief mixed with something warmer. She asked why a duke would spend his time carving wood for a stranger's fence post, and he admitted, after a long pause, that watching her mornings from his window had become the only peace he found in his days. The confession startled her, though she recognized the truth in it, having felt her own thoughts pulled toward him more than she wanted to confess aloud. She left a sprig of dried lavender tucked into the fence the next morning, a quiet answer to his wooden gift, and from then on, small tokens passed between them without either fully admitting what they meant. But peace rarely lasts long when it involves a duke and a farmer's daughter, and soon enough, sharper eyes than the villagers began to take notice of what was happening at the edge of Ashcombe's land. His aunt, Lady Margaret, who managed the household since his wife's passing, arrived unannounced one afternoon with concern etched deeply into her face. She had heard the rumors, the fence repairs, the baskets sent to a farming family with no obvious reason behind such generosity. She reminded Edward sharply of his responsibilities, of the arranged marriage still pending with a family of equal standing, a match meant to secure alliances that had taken years to build. Edward listened in silence, his jaw tight, though for the first time in years, he found himself unwilling to simply accept what was expected of him without question. That night he did not appear at the tree line, nor the next, nor the one after that. Alice noticed his absence more than she expected to, feeling an ache she could not fully explain to herself. She told herself it was foolish to feel this way about a man so far removed from her world, yet the mornings felt emptier without the quiet presence watching from the window across the field. Her mother noticed the change in her mood but said nothing, perhaps sensing the storm quietly building beneath her daughter's calm exterior. Word eventually reached Alice, through the same gossiping voices that had first alerted her to his attention, that the Duke's marriage arrangements were being finalized within weeks. The news struck harder than she expected, and she realized then how much she had allowed herself to hope for something impossible. Still, something in her refused to simply let the matter rest without at least understanding the truth from him directly, rather than through whispers passed from mouth to mouth across the village square. She walked to the manor gates one evening, her resolve steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest, and asked the guard to send word that she wished to speak with the Duke. It took longer than she expected for him to appear, and when he finally did, his expression carried both surprise and something like relief at seeing her standing there. She asked him plainly whether the rumors of his marriage were true, and whether the mornings he had spent watching her yard had meant anything real, or if she had simply imagined a connection that never truly existed. For a long moment, Edward said nothing, the silence stretching between them until she nearly turned to leave. Then he spoke, more openly than she had ever heard him speak before, admitting that watching her feed the chickens each morning had been the first time since losing his wife that he felt anything close to happiness. He confessed that the arranged marriage had been decided long before he ever noticed her, a duty placed upon him by family expectation rather than choice, and that the thought of proceeding with it now felt like losing something he had only just begun to understand mattered to him. Alice asked him directly what he intended to do about it, refusing to accept vague comfort in place of honest answers. Edward admitted he did not yet know, torn between the duty drilled into him since childhood and the quiet, unexpected feeling that had grown between them without either fully choosing it. He asked for time, not to decide between duty and feeling, but to find the courage to face his family with the truth of what he wanted, rather than what had simply been arranged for him. Alice left that evening uncertain of what would come next, but no longer doubting that whatever existed between them had been real all along. The following days passed slowly, filled with tension that seemed to hang over both the farmhouse and the manor alike. Word had reached Lady Margaret that Edward intended to break the arranged engagement, and her anger echoed through the halls of Ashcombe, warning him of scandal, of broken alliances, of the family name tarnished by his choice. Edward listened to every argument without flinching, having already made peace with the consequences long before she finished speaking. He explained calmly that he had spent years living by obligation alone, and that he refused to spend the rest of his life bound to a match built entirely on convenience rather than any genuine connection. News of the broken engagement spread quickly through the village and beyond, drawing sharp criticism from families who had expected the union to solidify important ties between two respected households. Alice heard the whispers grow louder, some praising the Duke's boldness, others condemning what they saw as reckless foolishness driven by nothing more than a passing infatuation. She braced herself for the judgment that would surely follow once his intentions toward her became known publicly, understanding that their difference in station would never be fully accepted by everyone around them. Edward arrived at the farmhouse himself the following morning, without guards, without his usual formal attire, dressed simply as though shedding the weight of his title along with his coat. He stood before her family, speaking plainly and respectfully, explaining his intentions honestly rather than hiding behind vague gestures or quiet visits at the fence line. Her father, though hesitant at first, found himself unable to deny the sincerity in the Duke's voice, nor the quiet happiness that had returned to his daughter's face in recent weeks despite the surrounding gossip and disapproval. Not everyone accepted the match easily. Some among the nobility distanced themselves from Edward entirely, viewing his choice as an embarrassment to his family's long-standing reputation. Yet the villagers, who had watched Alice's quiet kindness for years, offered their support more readily than expected, sensing something genuine in the bond between the two that outweighed the difference in their birth. Lady Margaret, though slow to accept the change, eventually softened when she saw how differently Edward carried himself now, no longer distant and burdened, but present and steady in ways she had not witnessed since before his wife's passing. Months later, the wedding took place quietly at Ashcombe Manor, small and simple by noble standards, yet filled with a warmth rarely seen within those old walls. Alice continued her mornings much as before, rising early to feed the chickens in the yard, though now Edward often joined her, no longer watching silently from a distant window but standing beside her, sleeves rolled up, scattering feed alongside her without any trace of the cold reserve the village once whispered about. The silent Duke, once known only for his solitude and grief, had finally found his voice again, not through grand speeches or noble declarations, but in the simple, steady presence of choosing her, morning after morning, for the rest of their lives.